So, good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and our visitors online and offline. The Ukraine Crisis Media Center starts its operation, and we'll have a discussion on the strategic development of education in the territorial communities. So, good afternoon. In the beginning, I'd like to start with a number of technical commands. For those of us listening to our meeting online, you have a chance to listen to this speech both in English and the translation into the Ukrainian, because we'll have an English language speaker.
In English, there would be an opportunity in Zoom to get into the English language channel to follow up. З цього я почну і спочатку оголошу той контекст.
Well, we'll start with a few words on the topic. We are doing the streaming on Facebook and YouTube at the UCMC. For almost a year, the experts from the Ukrainian Institute of Sociology, with the involvement of the Swiss expert under the project DOCIDE, as well as the Ministry of Education and Science, Ministry of Development of Territorial Communities, and Public Service Agency. Now, all of these experts were working on a large sociology research on education in territorial communities. Since territorial communities would be responsible for local education, we're talking about over 1,400 communities, and so this raised a lot of questions to the government, to the society, of how to deal with that issue. So this is going to be the topic for our conversation. We'll start with the introduction of this topic using the sociology as well as the experts. We'll try to talk on the results of the research and then talk on this strategy. So for those of you listening us online, you have a chance to ask questions. You can write them down, and my assistants will deliver those to me. Let me introduce the members of the first part who will be presenting the research. We'll have Natalia PROTASOVA, the director of the DOCIDE project, that is the Decentralization for the Development of Democratic Education in Ukraine. We have Valentina, POLTORAK, the manager of the Swiss-Ukrainian project DOCIDE. We also have Volodymyr, PANIOTTO, the General Director of the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, and we have the Anton HRUSHEVSKIY, the Deputy Head of the Institute. So at first we'll pass the floor to Natalia PROTASOVA. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to welcome all the participants of our today's meeting. Hopefully, our work that we'll present today will be interesting and important for resolving many challenges related to the education in the territorial communities. So, based on the local elections in 2020, over 1,400 territorial communities were established in Ukraine, and they were delegated with the authority to create a system of education. Now, those processes are happening as part of the decentralization reform in education. So, our project, called DOCIDE, which is the Decentralization for the Development of Democratic Education in Ukraine, is designed as specifically to support those regions and territorial communities in creating an effective management system for education. Although for proper understanding of the needs, it is important to do the constant monitoring. The first stage of the research that we'll be presenting today is all about the needs. I would say even priority needs that raise a number of concerns, and these are the ones that are crucially important for establishing the effective management over the educational system. And hopefully the results of the research that we'll present today that will be useful for establishing the national policy in the field of education, and that would be useful as well for the local authorities, and will do the regular monitoring of all the processes later on in this sphere. Hopefully, this national monitoring research will provide a chance to national authorities, to local authorities, as well as the active citizens in cooperation with the international donors and the civil organizations to combine their efforts and establish an effective and democratic educational system in different regions of Ukraine. So I wish all of us success, and I'm looking forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you. So, now I'd like to pass the floor to Valentina POLTORAK. She will tell about the directions of the research, and as this was the first research in the area of education. Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. Indeed, last year we've had some significant changes in our country. Over 1,400 territorial communities were established, and therefore the authorities with regards to all types of education were delivered to the territorial communities. These are new authorities for the TCs, because before that we had a centralized model of management, and most of the decisions in the field of education were made centrally at a level of regions or districts. And therefore those changes, they came up as a very difficult under a very difficult topic, that is a comprehensive reform of education in sectoral areas. What it means that territorial communities now have to deal with the new functions. We need to monitor this reform, we need to provide them assistance, because all those changes provided in the reform will have a significant impact. And talking about the reform, we're talking about over 30,000 of different educational institutions run under the territorial communities, with over 4 million students and over 450,000 teaching staff working on that. We're talking about a large number of people, and that is why this reform has to do with every single citizen of Ukraine. And in our communities, we have not only the educational institutions and the centers for advanced training of the teaching staff, inclusive and resource centers, as well as many other institutions. The local and territorial communities, they have a lot of responsibilities and authorities, and they have to understand what to do with them. That is why the research we'll be presenting today, it's all about those next steps, next directions, which should be implemented by the territorial communities. And as part of this research, the Kyiv Institute of Sociology made a poll out of 6,500 people. But the major questions were asked with regards to the availability of strategic planning within territorial communities in education. Then we talked about the monitoring system over the implementation of those strategic plans. We talked about the criteria used by the TC's territorial communities to verify if they effectively manage the education. Another important question was the management over the educational systems and institutions, so that the children would be entitled to a high-quality education in the TCs. Then we had a question regarding a secure and comfortable environment which could promote a high-quality education. We have many issues on our agenda related to the reform of the food supply in school and fire safety rules, and all of those issues are covered in the research. Then a whole lot of work in the research was dedicated to the personnel management. We're talking about the management, we're talking about the teaching staff, and now the territorial communities have all the chances, on all the opportunities to ensure a high level of teaching, as well as to develop their own management culture. The results will be presented later on. They are very interesting, and we have a significant list of work and activities we have to fulfill in the upcoming years. Besides, we've raised the issue of democratization, of management of governance, and we're trying to implement the Swiss experience, the international experience, and the implementation of the decentralization reform is impossible without citizens drawn to take decisions. And that is why we ask the citizens of territorial communities. We've asked the parents, the civil organizations operating those territorial communities. So, on the overall, we've made a poll among local authorities, teaching staff, citizens of communities, and all those interested in the field of education. And I'm extremely grateful to the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Development of Communities, National Agency of Public Service, as well as the Association of Territorial Communities for their expert assistance and support in running this research. Thank you, Volodymyr. I believe that Valentina started already to talk about the methodology of the research, and you can comment on that, right? Everything's working. Thank you. I should say that this research that we've conducted, this is the first ever research in the field of education. We had 6 previous sort of small researchers on decentralization in the past. And we've done some researches on the other reforms. And among all those researches that we've made before, we believe that the decentralization reform seems to be very successful and effective if compared with the rest of the reforms implemented in the country. This is the first ever research in the field of education, and I would say that this is a very profound. As you've already mentioned, we've asked 6,500 different participants of the research. We've done the research in all the oblasts, but we've paid special focus to those pilot oblasts or regions. In the same time, we wanted to make sure that the results we have would be representative. We've asked the management of different levels, at the level of state oblast administrations, local authorities, the different headmasters. We've asked 325 teachers, over 3,000 pupils, classes in 8th till 11th. Then we've asked over 3,000 of parents and the same number of the citizens of communities. The possible error could be 2 to 5%. I don't know if anyone can see my presentation currently, and there should be at least a presentation somewhere. So would like to ask for an assistance of our technical experts. You can continue in this meantime. So this is an enormous research, I would say, a very comprehensive one, over 100 pages. And this is not the final results. That is why we'll talk right now on a number of results. But the overall report, it will be published openly, so you can take a look at that. If there will be any inquiries and any questions, we can finalize the analysis in areas where necessary. Now, one of the questions, is there any strategic document on the development of education in the community or in the agency where respondent is working? So on the overall, should we talk about the management of the central executive authorities, over 50% of those officials told us that there is a strategic document like that. In the same time, 23% said no, there are no strategic document like that, and over 30 tell they don't know. Speaking about the management of the local administrations, over 80% of them told that there is a strategic document. Now, the other levels of management and state authorities and public officials working in them, as well as the teachers and the parents. Now, 50 to 60% of them told that there is a document like that. 48% of parents told that there is that document, although they might have less information. In most cases, like 55% of them were telling that they don't know if there is any document like that. When we asked, is there a need for such a document? The managers of local state administrations said, at least 58% of them said that there is a need for such document, and 21% said there is no need, and 17 gave a sort of an average estimate to whether there is a need or not in this document. Speaking about the public officials of local authorities, now 80% of them. Oh, here's the slides. In blue on this diagram, you can see those that believe that there is a need. Now, orange is those that don't need, and gray, that's the middle estimate. They're not sure. Now, speaking about the delineation of authorities, the question was, in the field of the education, the authorities of respective agencies are clearly divided between the oblast and local levels. Is that so? Now, half of the local authorities said that there is a clear delineation, 18 said that no, and 33% were, well, not aware of how to answer that question. Talking about the local state administration, the balance is 33 to 63. So they are happy with the way the authorities were delineated. At the same time, they believe in blue. They agree with that, and in orange, they don't agree with the delineation. Still, they believe that there is a need to coordinate the authorities between the local authorities and regional state authorities, and this needs further development. Almost all the public officials of the regional state administration believe it is a need. Whether there is a redundancy in the authorities of the educational authorities of local and oblast levels, the public officials of the oblast level said that there is redundancy, and almost half at local level could not answer that question. Speaking about the management of the oblast state administration, they believe that there is a redundancy. 38% believe that there is a redundancy, but mostly over 60% believe there is no redundancy. Whether there is a need to conduct further work in order to sort of explain the authorities of the local authorities and different other authorities. In light blue, says there is a mild need, and orange says there is no need. Something like 30% of the central authorities and local authorities believe that there is no need for that. At the same time, most of the people, of the officials, believe there is a need. As you can see, almost half of the circle is colored in light blue, and almost 70% believe that there is a need to do so. Now, further development of the professional qualities. We've asked whether they had an education in the field of decentralized educational management. On decentralization of management, now, central executive authorities, only 2% had some sort of a training or education. Speaking of Oblast authorities, 22% of their officials had this sort of training. 8% could not remember whether they had such training or not. Speaking on the education on the automation and democratization of management, we've asked the managers and the headmasters of schools and other institutions. 45% of the headmasters and managers passed this training, and 20% of the teaching staff passed that. 72% among the teachers have not participated in this sort of training. Whether there was an education on educational management over the past 3 years, 71% of the managers in local authorities, in state authorities did that. Then 50% of local authorities had this training. Now, should we increase that from 3 to 5 years? Most of the headmasters, something like 87% of them, had such a training. Then there is a question whether there is a need in training in the field of the management over the education. The Oblast state administration officials, 62 of them say that they would require that. Now, 87% of the officials and local authorities said that there is a need to do that. And at central executive authorities level, almost 100% of them believe there is a need for doing that. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Anton. As was already mentioned, the research covered a lot of topics on decentralization in education. One of the topics is the bureaucratization process. We can talk about different indicators of that, and one of them is the number of hours that the teaching staff is having to spend in order to fill in different documents, up to 3 hours. Then we can see that a lot of time is spent on filling the documents, and the managers of local authorities would have to deal a lot of time on filling the documents. And every third is saying that they are spending 6 to 12 hours per week on filling the reports. And third of them would need to fill the documents for 3 to 5 hours per week. And I believe this is something we need to develop in order not to have them spending a lot of time on reporting rather than on working effectively. Then the other slide is also about a very interesting topic for education. That's filling the information, the same information to different authorities, and 79% have to provide the same information in different reports to different authorities. Now, local authorities, 85% of them say that there is a need for some of them. And even the teachers say they do face with a situation whether they would need to file information in the same information in different reporting to different authorities. Now, the next slide is also about debureaucratization on supporting the paperwork. That is the question asked to the officials of local and oblast authorities, and most of them support the e-turnover of documents. What is important is the local authorities and oblast authorities, as well as the managers from local self-governments. Almost 90% of them support the transfer, but some of them would say that they were eager to support, but still they have some concerns with regard to that. They are not ready to fully support this, but we need to understand their needs and their concerns in order to make sure that this transition to electronic documents turnover would be smooth and non-problematic. Then there is an issue of funding to educational authorities. What are the sources of funding to modernization of infrastructure? and the local authorities and headmasters were mentioning state subventions from the state budget and the local budgets. The other sources, like the fund of the regional development or the currents of international organizations, these were mentioned by the minority of respondents. So, whether those two sources mentioned are enough, or should we promote the territorial communities to search for different grants and other sources of funding in order to diversify the source of funding and to increase the amounts of funds available? The other question was a fairly subjective one, but still, we've asked how do they assess the current level of development of the educational different facilities. But it was interesting for us to hear their point. The low level, that was the answer by 12% of respondents. 19% said that is a high level of development. Then 11% said that the level of development of the network of educational facilities is moderate. So we have a lot of work, and most of the respondents say that there is a need in a significant amount of work. But when we've asked about the availability of obstacles for the development of the proper network of educational institutions, only 27% mentioned there is significant obstacles, but then 36% of respondents said that there are minor obstacles. So every fourth respondent say that there are significant obstacles in further development of a network of educational institutions. We need to identify whether those are truly significant or those obstacles could be resolved in a proper manner. Then we were talking about the obstacles more specifically. What are those obstacles? And bad conditions for the transportation for the students, then unwillingness of the territorial communities to optimize the network of educational institutions, then failure to agree to the optimization of the educational institutions. We have one technical issue here, the transportation of pupils, and the rest deals with the optimization of the schools and how the community would respond to that. And this is not something related to education and to society only. It's just that whenever we are talking about optimization or reduction, the people tend to respond negatively to that. And we need to inform them, we need to warn them, we need to persuade them before taking those decisions. Another blocks of question was about a very important topic. These are gender issues, and you can see the gender and age issues, but still these are under the gender issues. The first question is the balance between men and women among the teaching staff. 55% of the population of Ukraine are women and 44 of them are men. But talking about the teaching staff, 85% are women and 15% are men. So we have a disproportion, and women tend to work more. Talking about the age, mostly 75% of them were respondents say that the average age would be 36 years or older. Yeah, we can say that they have a significant experience, but still, this is a question we need to raise on how to attract young generations to the teaching staff. We have to understand how many of the teaching staff are close to the pension age, and we have to understand how they would respond to innovations. Now, the other gender issues we had were whether everyone participate in different school projects, whether there is any differentiated relations or attitude towards men and women participating in different extracurricular activities. And the parents say they don't feel any differentiated attitude towards men, women, girls, and boys. The other question was more difficult. For whom it is easier to build a career, for a man or for women? We can see some optimistic results. 78% of the teachers and parents say that the success does not depend on the gender. That's good, but over 20% of the respondents voted in favor of either man or women, and most of the respondents mentioned man. 25% of those told that gender has an influence or an impact on the success. Now, most of them believe that these are the men who would have more success. And now there is a block, another one, and that we pay a lot of attention to. That is the democratic governance. The first question we've asked: what is the level of democratic governance in their educational institutions? So the level of response is an average one. 61% of the headmasters believe it's average, 47% of the teachers, and 45% of parents say so. Third part of the respondents said that it's low or they don't know the answer. Still, no more than 9% believe that it's low, but there are sort of an inclination towards an average marks. We cannot say anything bad about that, but anything good as well. Why are we asking if there is a need or if there is a chance to implement democratic governance in your education? Now, most of the respondents said that we can do that, and minority of respondents reject this, whether the democratic governance could be introduced in their educational institutions. Most of the headmasters, teachers, and parents believe that it's possible, and they would be willing to do so, and 4% would not agree to that. There are 23% for whom it is hard to answer to that question. Some because they don't understand what the term is about, and this is all about the need for informing. If most of the headmasters are aware of that topic, but at lower levels, which are also successful for the implementation of the reform, these are the teachers and the parents. It's a very important aspect for them. So we have to keep them informing what is the democratic governance and what's the advantages of that. Should we go lower to a lower level of students or pupils? And then there is a question whether they should be involved. Now, among the pupils, we have the following results. 47.5% says the level of democratic governance to be middle, then 30% says it's low, and 13 and 19% could not give their answers, which is fairly significant results. And that means that we do need to inform the pupils. We do need to persuade them that that's important for their education, because that would have an impact on the success of their future careers. Then we talked about the civil budget, and we've asked for different public officials, and 42% of the public officials at local level said there is a practice like that. The rest would say that they are not aware of that. And 27 or 28% of respondents said that they're not aware of any civilian budgets, whether they exist or not. And that was fairly strange, because these were the public officials of local authorities or headmasters, and they seem to be the most aware of the processes, but for some reason they were not able to respond to that. All of that tend to confirm that there is a certain gap in the information that is provided to different officials. We also talked about the network of educational institutions. Then we had a question about the modernization of the educational infrastructure. 90% of local authorities and the headmasters working in those educational institutions say that the educational institution has been developing recently. almost half of them says there is a significant development, and half of them say there is a minor development. So we are talking about the development, and this is something that is extremely important for further support of the processes that we are having. Talking about the pupils and the way they feel themselves at schools, how comfortable are they in school, because all the work is done for the sake of those pupils, really. Now, the majority of students feel safe and comfortable in school. They like studying at schools, although we can question their sincerity, but most of these pupils and students say that they feel pretty comfortable at schools. So, on the average, the results are pretty optimistic. At the same time, there is a number of aspects that we have to look to. Only 58% of the respondents saying that they have or they're receiving an advanced knowledge or a comprehensive knowledge which would be necessary for their life. This is a fairly significant amount of students, but still we need to think of that, whether we could develop that number. Most of the pupils never had faced bullying or violence, but still 28% agreed that in their school they had a situation with bullying, and that's a significant number of pupils. And then 13% of pupils said that there were cases of violence. We were not asking about how regular those were happening, because this could be like one-time event, but still this is something that exists, and this may be happening later on. So we need to analyze this issue in order not to create a toxic environment for those pupils studying at schools. This slide is in the end, but still, the last but not the least is how transparent is the local authorities to the citizens, because the level of transparency has an impact on the level of support that is granted by the parents and teachers, and unfortunately we don't have a very optimistic results. 35% of respondents believe local authorities are transparent, and 47% believe the local authorities are not transparent, so we would need to work on that. Otherwise we won't have the support to reform. And we have the final slide, which is very optimistic. This is something that we tend to hear, that we need to combine our efforts. This is a question whether the territorial communities are cooperating in the field of education. Now, 97% of local authority officials say that they cooperate with other communities in the field of education, and 98% support there is a need for cooperation in education. At least in words, they are showing their readiness to cooperate with other communities, because this is a joint interest for all of us, and every single community would have its benefit out of that. So this would be absolutely important for the teachers, for the headmasters, as well as for the pupils and the parents. That was the very final slide, and now I would like to pass the floor to the other speakers in order to discuss the results. Thank you, Anton and Volodymyr. I know we have some time restraints, because there will be a discussion among members of parliament, representatives of Ministry of Education, Ministry for the Development of Communities, and there will be representatives from the Embassy of Switzerland. So please explain for the journalists and experts how can they find this research, where they can get this research. Maybe there is a very topical question on the essence of the reform, on the report and the research. But I know that Valentina, she will remain with us for a certain period of time. She will be able to answer your questions. But still, I can give a comment and I can answer this question. This report will be posted on our informational resources, particularly our website, DOCIDE.ua. Then there will be the publication of this reform on the website on decentralization. You will have a lot of other materials on education. And we'll also post this report on the websites of the Ministry of Education. And of course, we'll have another website posting that report. So, Valentina and Anton, thank you for your work. And I'd like to invite the rest of the participants to join this discussion on the strategic development of decentralization. Please, Vyacheslav Nehoda, I'd like to invite you to the stage, the Deputy Minister for the Development of Communities and Territories of Ukraine. Also, I would like to invite Oleg Yaresko. He's working in the Ministry of Education and Science, please. And we have also Nicole, the director of the Swiss Bureau for Cooperation at the Switzerland Embassy in Ukraine. I guess everyone here. I would like also to add that we have a lot of participants online. Roman Lozinski, First Deputy Head of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on the Organization of Public Authorities, Local Authorities, Regional Development, and Urban Planning. Natalia Pipa, the Secretary of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Education, Science, and Innovations. We have Alexander Koryaky, the head of the All-Ukrainian Association of Communities and head of the New Ukrainian Territorial Community, and Marina Konovets, the head of the Center of Adaptation of Public Service to the Standards of European Union at the National Agency of Ukraine on Public Service. So there's a whole lot of participants. But I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Nehoda. He's the representative in the Ministry for the Development of Communities. We're talking about over 1,400 of communities, and over 50 of them are spending a lot for education. And we would like to understand what could be the strategy for the development after all the information that you've heard and up to this trial first year of their operation. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to express words of gratitude for being able to participate in this presentation on the results of sociological research, and I'd like to express words of gratitude to the project members as well as to the Embassy of Switzerland and to the Institute for this enormous work that they've done. Because we had 6 waves of sociological reports on decentralization, and we believe that any reform should be based on sort of measuring the temperature, the thoughts of the society and their attitudes towards this or that reform. And it's very good that today we've gathered at discussing a very important part of the decentralization reform, a part related to education, and talking on the reform on decentralization. Now, the educational sphere, both the sphere of health protection and the social sphere, they are very crucial. And the level of quality of services in those spheres truly define the quality of the overall reform. Because we are not simply trying to create a new system of administrative governance that was established back in 2019. So the only purpose was not only to provide the authorities, to delegate them authorities, but to create an effective territorial communities and effective local authorities that would be able to provide high quality services. Talking about the territorial communities, we've established 1,470 of them, and of course not everyone had a choice and had an election, but still, I mean, except for the occupied territories. Now all of those communities started to provide services, and starting from the previous year, most of the communities started operating anew. Why am I saying most? Because some of the communities already acquired previously the experience because they were self-governed cities or urban territories. But still, I'd like to say that now all the communities have equal rights and authorities in the field of education, equal resources, and equal responsibility to the citizens and under the law. What is important to underline is that the authorities in the field of education, those are the authorities delegated by the state. And therefore, in order to provide the funding for the salaries of teaching staff, there are other budgetary programs now. This is provided in the form of subventions from the state budget, but the rest of the funding, the maintenance, the establishment of networks in accordance to the national standards and requirements, this is something that has to be resolved by local authorities. And despite the fact that majority of the results of sociological research, I would call them an optimistic, particularly the very final slides, we still have to take into consideration that the previous year was only the first year for most of the communities to operate independently. Particularly, we had over 800 communities that were established and new, and they had zero experience in dealing with a lot of authorities. So they had to establish budgets, and they had to establish different offices and departments, and you basically. And of course, we have to take that into consideration, because should we compare the thoughts of citizens in the communities that have already established their institutional bodies, there is some sort of a maturity of those social institutions, particularly those communities established in 2015, 2016, to the respondents of this communities established last year. I think there would be a change in their responses. But still, those changes that were made, hopefully that will change the opinions of the respondents. And this is something that we can see from the sociological polls. What is also important, and together with our partners from the Ministry of Education, which sets the policy, and as we have seen today, there is a need for training for local authority officials who, according to the results of the research, not all of them understand how the delineation of functions is being established. In the same time, the law on local state authorities and oblast state administration, there are 5 laws on education. I think all those documents clearly identify who should deal with what. If someone has troubles understanding that, we need to teach them. This is particularly related to local authorities who take full responsibility for preschool and secondary education and higher educations as well. Therefore, the issue of professionalization for public officials and local authorities and oblast authorities, this is something that is absolutely crucial, and this is something that we'll need to take into consideration. We'll have to create a training system for such officials. On the other hand, we at the central level, we would be able to come up with some sort of guidelines or recommendations only. But we could provide this information to the different local authorities and to different managers of schools and institutions, but they have to work as well. What raises some concerns, and hopefully we'll be able to eliminate that concern, that is the numbers and the redundancy in terms of different instructions coming from local and oblast authorities. And in most cases, the principal specialist at certain level will have to prepare similar reports to different authorities, and he would be working day and night on filling the different reports for with the same information. Of course, we would like to monitor the whole system of local authorities and how the reform is being implemented, and we would need some indicators for that. And I'm sure that the Ministry of Education and our ministry are sending different inquiries. In the very end, it results in an overload for principal specialists and lower level experts. So we would need to reduce the appetite, so to say, of central executive authorities and oblast and local authorities in terms of the number of the inquiries that are being sent, because this produces a lot of paperwork. And we've started a new portal at the Decentralization website, and there is a number of statistic and demographic indicators. There will be a whole block dedicated to education, and we'd like to plot the whole educational network, and we'll be working with the Ministry of Education on that. According to the decision of the CNSDU, in January, we had a test run presentation for information and analytical system of statistics data on territorial communities. And we've included different blocks into this system, particularly related to indicators in the field of education, healthcare, and social support. So we'll try to plot all of that information on some sort of a map, depending on the territory. Hopefully there will be more detailed information later on. There will be a whole network with specifications, with indicators, with number of pupils, maybe some other indicators as well. So hopefully we'll have an agreement on that part with the partners that we're working on. And hopefully we'll, with the support of the DOCIDE and with the embassy, we'll be able to finalize this project. In the end, I would like to express words of gratitude for this work. This is a very important aspect for our ministry and the Ministry of Education. We are ready for cooperation, and considering the results that we've received, I think we can offer some new models for coordination and management of the educational system. What is important is to offer some sort of standards on the operation of those institutions so that they would be accessible and comfortable and be able to prepare a highly professional citizens of Ukraine that would definitely feel proud of living that community or attending that school. Thank you. Thank you. I saw that the colleague from the Ministry of Education was nodding his head when we had a conversation about the redundancy. That was Oleg Yaresko. Now, a question to you: how you are going to use the results of this research? Any of your upcoming plans? But in accordance to the international research, there is a significant gap between the village school and the urban school. We're talking about many different qualities. Now, how this reform would be able to close this gap between some sort of a village pupils or village education and urban schools or and urban pupils? Thank you for this question and a chance to speak. First of all, I'd like to express words of gratitude to the project for this research. I fully support my colleague that you won't be able to see all the challenges sitting in the office in Kyiv, and some of those field trips there that we have, they would not be able to let us have the big picture, and that is why those researchers are absolutely crucial. They allow us to understand the gaps. I can't say there was a lot of surprises. So I would say we expected something like that on most of the experts. But still, I'd like to raise the concern on the local level uh, of the officials and local authorities in terms of their willingness to try and to learn something more. So maybe later on everyone would support their readiness to pass the training. The changes that we are having in our country are revolutionary, I would say. We are developing a civil society, we are delegating the authorities, particularly in the field of education in schools and kindergartens, to local authorities. That is a courageous step that was taken. But still, I'd like to say that they're not left alone to deal with those challenges. There is a financial support. There's a number of subventions to the educational institutions, and our colleagues from the Ministry of Regional Development, they will promote further allocation of subventions to local budgets on the development of kitchens at schools. Problem of food at schools, that was a problem that have been accumulating for many years, and we started finally to resolve this. Then there is a subvention, and we are preparing documents for that. A subvention for a capable school development. We're talking about some of the funds for capital repairs and major refurbishments, as well as a subvention to support this reform on new Ukrainian school. That is budgets for training of the teaching staff and budgets for the development, allowing to procure certain equipment to increase the level of education. That's going back to your question. Indeed, the schools in cities, they have more capabilities, but this is not only because of the territory they're located to. It's just that in cities there are advanced training institutions, and in village schools they have problems with roads, with the transportation, so they have their own problems, they have their own challenges. In some cases they don't have a chance to acquire some advanced equipment. So the times has changed right now, so you won't be using a piece of chalk and a blackboard. So that's not enough. You cannot do everything remotely, but you won't be able to do some practical jobs and practical tasks. Only those practices that will be able to allow you to build the competences. That is why over 1.5 billion hryvnia were allocated to delivering this capabilities. Then there is a subvention on fire safety at schools, and in recent years we had many notifications and many messages on the violations revealed at schools. Fortunately, there were no victims, but the situation was be sort of neutralizing. Then we are talking about the possibilities for inclusive education and any subventions that would be necessary for that. So this is something that we are thinking of. Uh, and we have a lot of positive information that was received from the research. It's good that the respondents are willing to share their experience, so not every community would need to invent something new. They can share their own achievements, and at the level of oblast departments of education, we are trying to make some presentations, and our colleagues are sharing the experience. This cooperation is very important. Going back to the quality, uh, Anton had a slide on the level of satisfaction with the education and whether it's up to the challenges of the modern days, and unfortunately the results were not very satisfactory. That is why we are working on the state standards for higher education and for high school education, and we'll try to make sure that those skills and knowledges gained throughout those higher classes would be of a greater value, and so there will be no gap between the village and the municipal schools. Hopefully, we would have a very competitive opportunities. The next speaker have limited time. Roman Lozinski, the first deputy of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on the Organization of Public Authorities, and I'm not going to continue on that. Roman has joined us, so please switch on the sound, please, the microphone. So the question is, in this year, the reform starts for the classes number 5 to 9, and we're creating legislation for this reform of the new Ukrainian school for classes 5 to 9. What would be the role of territorial communities in implementing this reform, particularly in terms of legislative aspects? I know you hadn't chance to read at this research or the report, but maybe you can give a number of comments on that. Thank you, all the colleagues. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that these lawmakers, either in the field of education or in the field of local authorities, it's important for them to be aware of their reality, because whenever they're working with local communities, we can see some real problems. Still, we don't want to build an irrelevant logics, because every community has different starting positions. They have different level of starting level of management. They have different levels of resources. That is why this research is extremely important for us. I've already had a conversation with some of the colleagues, and I had a brief information on the results of this research, and of course we'll be spreading the results of this research about with our colleagues, because the decentralization reform is not completed, and we only passed one of the stages, and the capability of those territorial communities would not be developed on itself, would not be developed simply because some of the MPs are working great. This capability comes with years, with systematic efforts. That is why the results of this the research, they are allowed to, to do some strategic planning, to not deal with some small steps, but rather start planning the development of our territories. And of course, we have a Ministry of Education, we have a committee at the Verkhovna Rada on education, and of course, we have a proper cooperation in between of the communities and the MPs. But still, the local authorities, the level of oblast administration, the level of this vertical and horizontal ties is absolutely crucial. And they have to build their decisions on the data. And that is why I'm extremely grateful for the research that you've done. And we'll need to discuss this results for many times. And I'm sure we'll be working with this research. And I'm confident that we'll have some additional questions. Maybe we'll have some proposals with regards to the conclusions on the research. So, on behalf of the committee, I would like to express words of gratitude. Well, the journalists and the experts now would have a chance to provide us with some specifics and some specific questions. Maybe they will be asking about the commitments. But my question to Natalia Pipa, which is the secretary of the Rada Committee on Education, Science and Innovations, a more specific question. How important is this inquiry of pupils and their parents on the safe school environment? You've initiated the allocation of funds on fire safety in 2022. So what would be this sort of support? And there is a question on further steps in creating specialized lyceums in territorial communities. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for those specific questions and for the research. I'll make a small introduction and then I'll start answering those questions. The research shows a sad trend, I would say, speaking about the democratic processes, and that is only 30% in the educational institutions. This is something that would take years to change. And the gap between the village school and the city school is significant. And I believe that we will find additional 100 million to provide to different institutes, and I will make sure that there will be a transfer of funds that is 100 million from the presidential university to the to receiving proper results. And the communities unfortunately now the speaker is speaking very slow. Everyone understands the importance, and we have better results. And whenever there are people not interested in education, then the results are worse. I'm sure that everyone supports the decentralization at schools, but I believe that oblast departments, and this is something mentioned in the research, they understand more about the need of this strategy. And there's 80% of them who support this strategy. But this is not the case for the territorial communities. Not every one of them understands the advantages of the new Ukrainian school when there is a need not only for the knowledges but the competences. They should be aware how to develop the teachers in order to build the tendencies, in order to build the competences. And this requires some additional funding. And therefore, whenever we're talking about the educational environment, and I'd like to give you another statement, there is a bigger problem when there is like up to 50 kids attending school without heating, without professional teachers, when one teacher is teaching like 4 or 5 subjects, then it's better to build a road from that village, to have a school bus taking the kids from that village to the other village with better school. So it's better for those kids to go to the school which could offer them a high level of education. I mean, in Germany, for example, they have twice as less number of schools that we have. So we need to develop the infrastructure in the villages, and therefore the villages, the people would be eager to remain in villages. So we definitely need to ensure a good education for every pupil, and not just good education. This is something that we can see from the research, and there is a part of the people that clearly understand and support this, and there are part of the people that are rejected. Speaking on the subvention on fire safety, it's great that we've managed to ensure this subvention, and of course it will be able to cover all the issues. It's just one of the steps. We're planning to have 50% funding from the state and 50% from the communities on fire safety measures, and that means that at least 60 million will be allocated to every oblast, and that means that those facilities that they have any problems with fire safety, they can do some maintenance in terms of wiring or any other aspects in order to cover any of the gaps in terms of the fire safety. Later on, we will decide whom to allocate the funds and how the procedure will be done. But this is where the Ministry of Education have to work. We'll be waiting from the Ministry of Health for the approval of regulations on how this subvention will be allocated. So hopefully it's going to be happening faster this year, and everyone would understand the procedure for allocating the subventions. Speaking on the specialized lyceums, this is one of the stages for the development of new Ukrainian school. They will be in Ukraine since 2027. So there will be specialized schools starting from 2027. The main idea about those lyceums, we have 17 to 25 subjects in senior classes. And the idea is that the pupils would be able to select their specialization for the classes 10s, 11s, and 12s. And we would need to work hard in the state. We need to select a variety of lyceums, and there will be a need for developing certain classes. There would be a need for developing some sort of enrollment procedure. We'll be learning from the experience of other countries, and some of the communities, for example, Khmelnytskyi Oblast or Lviv Oblast, they've already established a number of lyceums without waiting for the nation to come up with its regulation. Thank you for your answer. We'll try to ask Mr. Yaresko, but I'd like to pass the floor to Alexander Koryny, who's the head of the All-Ukrainian Association of the Communities, also coming from the field of education. So, Alexander, please respond to that. And Alexander could respond that, and he could also make a direct statement to representatives of the ministries. Yes, we understand that the communities don't have the resources of large cities, but what have you seen and how those local communities could be providing the education? What challenges have you been facing? Any questions or comments that you have to the colleagues? Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to express words of gratitude for this work, for this research, because indeed we were lacking the specific numbers and the specific analysis. And I would say that education is of a crucial importance, not only because it's 65 to 80% of the budget of every community. It's important because the education is always a kind of a crossroad. It's all about the food supply, the fire safety, the teaching, the transportation. There's many issues that you need to resolve in order to ensure good education. My first point, after looking at this research, is that we need to work with managers in the field of education. We need to analyze the situation. Having analyzed the situation, we need to come up with the changes we would need to introduce. Because the Institute of Elders, most of the elders believe that, well, don't remove the school from that village. Let's have a school for 10 kids, but that should be a school in the village, really. So not everyone has an approach to development of those schools. When non-professionals are being appointed to different positions, when people are not receiving any advanced training, when they don't understand the future development of the schools, that is the problem. We need to come up with new cases, new solutions. We need to show how the rest of the colleagues dealt with that. Another important issue we haven't raised before, that is the organization of food supplies in schools, or fire safety, or many other challenges that we are facing today. I think we need to analyze further. We need to work with this material and to provide some recommendations. So we as the association would need to work with the managers and to find some common issues and common grounds in order to make sure that the educational services would be of a higher quality. Because the teachers might have one approach, the parents would have another approach, but still our major function would be to provide high quality services so that our pupils or students would be competitive upon the graduation. And we also need to focus not only on the secondary education, but on the preschool education as well, because unfortunately, this is where the community is left alone, and under the motive of saving budgetary funds, some would be closing preschool institutions. And this results in having a lot of problems for the kids in different communities. So this is a very comprehensive issue. I'm not aware of the situation in the big cities. Maybe the Association of the Cities can do that. But in small communities, where 65 and 80% or 80% of their budget spent on education, this is a very significant issue for them. So thank you for gathering all of us today. The education is really something that you need to analyze, to prognosticate. And thank you really for this research. We'll be developing our recommendations on the basis of that. Later on, I will ask the colleagues to respond. But before that, Natalia mentioned, and you mentioned, about the importance of best practices, the experience, or the need to compare with other countries. And I'd like to pass the floor to Nicole. Rada, as we have a common project with the support of the Swiss embassy. Why is that? Because Switzerland has a lot of experience in terms of decentralization. And my question to her, I will interpret this question: why is that specifically important? What best practices could be important, could be useful for Ukraine? Or I can see you already have the interpretation. So Ms. Rada will be speaking English, and then there will be an interpretation into Ukrainian.
Yes, indeed. Oh, I hear myself now. Here we go. Indeed, I'll be speaking English. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. And you've asked me two very interesting questions. One, why is Switzerland supporting this project? And the other one is, what are the lessons learned or the best practices that I could share from Switzerland? So why are we supporting this research? Why are we supporting the link between decentralization and teaching and education? One part of the answer, and I have a running bet with Deputy Minister Nehoda, will I manage in every statement I make to mention my mother? And the answer is yes, I can. My mother was a teacher. She's now retired, but always gave me an understanding of how important education is, not only for the children and what is being taught, but also the educational environment in which teachers actually work. So Switzerland has been engaged in decentralization in Ukraine for a very long time. And we are very impressed with what Ukraine has done, because as much as Switzerland is decentralized, we have never decentralized. We have been trying since 1291 to centralize. We've always been decentralized. But it does give us a certain expertise over literally hundreds of years how to function in a decentralized way, including on education. For us, working on the link between education and decentralization in Ukraine is a logical extension and a continuation of our engagement on decentralization. The changes that you have seen in education because of decentralization reform are huge. And in many ways, because education is such an emotional topic, parents are engaged, parents are interested. Parents will judge, to a certain extent, local governments and local authorities according to the progress they can make on education. We have seen the study, we have seen the results. There is room for improvement, so it's also a good thing, because it means local hromadas can actually make a difference and demonstrate that things can be improved and done differently. But it also means that education will, in the end, be one of the factors against which decentralization is measured. But to come to, I think, the core of your question. So I said Switzerland has never decentralized, but we are very decentralized. I would like to mention 3 different topics where we feel it's really important to keep the focus of that. The reason why decentralized education makes sense is because education needs standards and curriculums and targets, but it also needs to adapt to the communities it works in. One example, in some rural communities in Switzerland, there is still 1 week less of summer holidays and an additional week of harvest holidays because kids are actually engaged at home as well. It doesn't change the curriculum, but it's a decision that was taken at the local level because locally it makes sense. It is compulsory for everybody to learn French in the German-speaking part, but the number of French lessons in communities close to the line of language change in Switzerland is much higher the closer you get to the French-speaking part than the further away you get from the French-speaking part. And then last but not least, and I think this is key because it is about trust in the education system, and that is the engagement of parents in the governance of education. Parent-teacher associations, but beyond that, school committees, elected participants in school committees from hromadas, from among the parents. This builds the trust that you need. And if I look at the figures that we saw for the 35% of people don't really trust local governance, local authorities, or don't think it is transparent, improving that is going to improve education as such for sure. I'm not going to comment on all the findings that were presented because I think this is a very rich study. It gives a lot of information to a lot of different actors in the education and decentralization sphere. And in particular, it allows everybody to identify priorities, to make sure we have no blind spots, and to have the security that those things that were confirmed are really like that, and not just because we want them to be. I think it's the representative from the Ministry of Education who said understanding and knowledge is key. And it's key not just for students, but it's actually key for teachers, for local governments, for ministries. If we understand what is needed, we're not going to waste money on things that are not needed. We hope that DOCIDE is going to contribute and continue to contribute to that knowledge and understanding and how we can most effectively and efficiently move forward. And then last but not least, I would like to make a very small link to another project that we are supporting. And I really believe that within all the things that need to be done on education and improving the educational environment, and because it's something that I always felt strongly about as a kid, is school nutrition. Schools provide food for the brain, but the brain only functions if schools also provide good nutrition. And with that, I will hand back.
Є на що відреагувати, але нас чекає.
There is what to respond. We have Marina Konovets, the director for the Standardization. And there is a question. We can see that the decentralization reform resulted in a significant increase in the number of officials in local authorities. And do you plan to train those public officials, newly elected public officials, in the field of education? And we've seen from the research that many people simply don't understand some of the aspects. They don't understand the authorities, so they need proper training. Thank you. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to this event and answering to your questions. I was planning my statement in a different manner, but still, I'd like to start by saying that the National Agency for Public Service has developed a number of draft laws on working in local authorities, and there is an aspect dealing with the professional training and advanced training for public officials of local authorities, and the national agency is currently preparing or the guidelines, so to say, on the training of public officials and local self-governed bodies, because there is a need for that. And the sociological research that we've heard about today, it also mentions this. So hopefully we'll take into consideration all these research recommendations. We'll use them definitely and will be effectively plan our work. And just to mention about the memorandum that was signed between our agency and the Civil Organization for Development of Competences in Ukraine with regards to the implementation of the Swiss-Ukrainian project DOCIDE. And under this memorandum, we are planning a series of activities. So today, we had a chance to see the results of the research, and we're grateful to the Institute for doing this hard work. So now we have a true to life results, and talking about the participation of our agencies, we've ensured the participation of different members of local authorities. I'd like to focus your attention on a number of aspects, particularly speaking on the issue of education and the professional development. We can see that our public officials, they pass certain training on education as well. But speaking on decentralization in the management of the educational institutions, you've seen some significant results. Only 2.5% of respondents said that had training. Not everyone said that they have even an opportunity to do so. So there is an emergent need of offering this education and training for them. Then there is an issue that there is a need for training in decentralized management over the education. And there were a significant number of public officials requiring this sort of training and education. This is something we'll be taken into consideration for our further work, as well as in cooperation with this project. And hopefully this training will be organized for our public officials. And of course, there is an issue of democratic governance and advanced training on democratic governance in the field of education. This is also very important, and hopefully we'll be able to take that consideration as well. And together with the project, we'll be working on them, because this survey clearly showed an immediate need for that. And it wasn't surprising that 90% of the managers require further clarifications in the field of strategic planning, budget planning, procurements. So those issues that they have to deal with on the everyday basis, that is the management and the funding. This is very important for our managers at local level, and we have to pay attention to that. And of course, in the end, I would like to underline that in addition to the sociological survey and the memorandum, we have a plan of joint activities and the civil organization for the development of civil competences until 2024. We have a number of activities planned, and there will be two major ones. First of all is the support of interministerial activity on the implementation of decentralized management of education, and of course the development of short-term advanced training curriculums on decentralized management of educations for public officials and representatives of local authorities and local self-governments. So those training curriculums will be created and adapted both for online learning and offline learning. So hopefully we'll continue this work together with the project. And in the end, I'd like to express words of gratitude for the many years of cooperation with this project. The members of the project team are highly professional. So looking forward to our future work. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the discussion of these efforts. Thank you, Marina. Now I'd like to ask a question to Valentina POLTORAK. She's the manager of the project, Decentralization for the Development of Democratic Education. You're the stakeholder of the research. And when this discussion was organized, it's called Strategic Development of Education in Territorial Communities of Ukraine. So since we have this opportunity, since we have these enormous amount of data, since we have the representatives of the Ministry for the Development of Territorial Communities, Ministry of Educational and Science, and specialized public officials. Now, what's your largest impetus? Where's your largest focus? What is something that you believe that should be taken into consideration? Anything you would like to underline? Or maybe you would like to ask a question to your colleagues? Thank you. That's a very wise comment and a question. As was mentioned by all the speakers, this is only the beginning of the reform. That is why it's important for all of us to combine our efforts and to develop the further steps. And this is something that we've started in 2021. And hopefully this research that you've seen today will result in some real live steps, will result in a strategy that will ensure this support from the state to local authorities and to educational institutions and educational managements. We are absolutely confident that we shall be monitoring our process and that there will be a common strategic document, maybe a concept, or maybe a separate strategy or a roadmap on sectoral decentralization in the field of education. So, going back to Mr. Negoda and Mr. Yaresko, what can you say about this type of document? Do you believe it's necessary? Any plans of developing this document? And also I would like to respond to those previous comments that you've heard. So that's a high time for you to respond to all the comments and to answer the questions. Well, thank you. Thank you. In the course of this discussions, I haven't seen or haven't heard any sort of other thoughts. all of us are interested in making sure that would be a high quality education in Ukraine. All of us are interested in a high quality education in local communities. We can talk about a network, we can talk about curriculums, we can talk about many things, but the main indicator that I think the Ministry of Health would be using, but I'd say the Index of Human Development is the major indicator for any country. We could talk about the energy resources today. We can talk about anything, but the major resource is the human potential. And this is something that is developed back at schools. So the compatibility of our country would depend on the capacities developed at schools. Speaking on my ministry, I haven't mentioned in the beginning that the citizens of Ukraine started to recognize that the infrastructure of schools is being changed. There's repairs and refurbishment in process, which is very good. So now the country is, together with the territorial communities, is creating all the conditions for proper education. There are subventions for more comfortable conditions of education. Then there is a challenge that we would need to resolve. That is to have a concept on every community, or maybe there should be an overall strategy with dedicated chapters to different communities. There has to be an understanding whether there would be like major schools. We need to understand about the network of schools. Because whenever we are talking about the transportation issues, it's evident that we would need to develop road infrastructure, we need to develop safety, we would need to work with schools. But we would definitely need to cover those issues. We also need to cover another aspect that was not mentioned today. That is the demographics. That could be positive, that could be negative. Crucially negative, I would say, because we might have problems in territorial communities that were established on the basis of village communities. Unfortunately, the urbanization process, as well as the birth rates, would not promote in having an increase in the number of pupils in village communities. And looking at the current indicators, we can make certain predictions of what situation we would have in 5 to 10 years. And when we were establishing territorial communities, we tried to take into consideration different capacities and specifications. Now, one of those indicators was the number of pupils, as this is the potential of the community. So hopefully together with the Ministry of Education and other partners, we'll need to provide with the tools for setting the strategy for the development of education. That is, every community, every territorial community would need to do some sort of an assessment with due consideration on the number of pupils they have. I mean, they would need to understand what sort of networks should they build and how this should be done. I mean, we could invest billions of hryvnia in infrastructure, but after a certain period of time, we might end up in a situation where there would be no pupils or less number of pupils. And this is something that needs to be considered. So our ministry will be always close together with you. As you can see, we were always together, no breaks. We'll be working. We are extremely interested in developing this area. and making sure that our level of education is the best. Oleg, I would like to compliment, but speaking on, I'll start with disinventions. The ministry has prepared all the documents, and they're being coordinated with other stakeholders, particularly the subvention on fire safety is currently sent for approval of the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Digital Transformation, and the subvention on the capable school after the report of the Ministry of Justice that will be supplied to the Cabinet of Ministers. So hopefully will be available for providing with every mechanism and tools. And I'd like to express words of gratitude to Switzerland for the support of the project and for the examples that you've raised, because Switzerland has an enormous experience in decentralization and education and those dual forms of education. There's so many interesting things. Maybe we'll initiate some separate consultations. Maybe there could be a separate area in your project in terms of sharing the experience. I fully support the involvement of parents in the businesses and other local communities, not only in the creating of necessary conditions, but in setting the contents of education, those curriculum and syllabus that you've mentioned. This is something that is crucially important. We have certain experience in terms of the amending the syllabus, and we want to work more for higher school, because it's all about the quality of education, which is mentioned by everyone. We need to integrate our efforts, and I would like to recall that last summer the Minister of Education has presented the different equipment for increasing the level of education. So we would be trying to engage the businesses, the local communities, the parents, and the pupils, as they can also help in terms of identifying the further ways or directions of the development for the sake of further development of education. And of course, we'll be looking forward to the cooperation with you. Thank you. And I'd like to ask our audience online to ask their questions, and we have some people with us in this room. Do you have any questions? And the nutrition issue was raised by our colleague from Switzerland. This is a popular issue. Anything that you'd like to raise, any questions that you wanted to give us? And please tell how many of you would like to ask their questions. Dmytro Sinyak, Portal Decentralization. What would be the destiny of this research? What would be the next steps taken by the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Territorial Communities to implement those results and to settle all those challenges that you've heard today? I will start today. We'll start. And Valentina said that there will be a document prepared, a roadmap will be prepared on settling those challenges in terms of the training of public officials and many others. So the first step, this is something I can give you. I would like to invite Valentina and representatives of the Institute. We might have a meeting on Monday with the heads of different departments on education. So maybe we could have a presentation of the research on the results of this research. So we'll be working together in order to implement the results of the research. Please, any other questions? Good. I'm also looking for any questions coming from the online audience. Maybe there are some, but Valentina, are you satisfied with the response that was given by the Deputy Minister, anything that you are planning to do. I'd like to underline that this is a partnership. It's a partnership between the ministries and the project, because the project is all about the support of reform and the government in implementing this reform. So we have a consolidated position among the ministries and the committees joining our discussion. And we have our only wish to make the territorial communities develop in order not to have our pupils leaving the country for abroad, for them to stay in Ukraine and develop their careers. So education plays a crucial role in that. And I believe we need to have more regular meetings in order to develop the ways and the mechanisms for implementing the results of the research in the state policy. We have a common understanding on the necessity of that. And hopefully during the upcoming month, we'll have a series of strategic sessions. We'll let all the partners aware of the results of the research in a more profound manner, and we'll try to come up with the next steps. In the beginning, since I have some time, I would like to ask Ms. Nigoda once again. You said that there were no so significant surprises, and nobody would say that the education is not necessary, that that is a key. But considering this year that we have right now, anything that you're lacking, any real obstacles that we could neutralize right now through coordination with local authorities, or at the level of national authorities, or at the level of legislation, since we had representatives of Verkhovna Rada today. We clearly understand that nothing could be perfect and that nobody is working. That's the kind of a trial mode. It's normal to have difficulties. I tend to think positively. Then it's going to be great, because we have so many negative aspects today. If there are any obstacles or challenges, it's hard to come up with an average temperature in all the communities to say where it's all good and where it's all bad in communities. But my colleague from Ministry of Health mentioned this meeting with the heads of departments. I think this information on when to focus and where to focus is important. We need to work at all levels. And then oblast administrations have to work as executive authorities. They have to work with local communities, with territorial communities, because the education and the authorities in delegation were delegated. It's not that the territorial community are doing whatever they want and they're using any curriculum, any syllabus they want. It's their responsibility. Speaking on the most pressing issues that we're planning to reserve with the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, we've just established a working group before the new year, a working group on distribution of the educational subvention. We have representatives of central executive authorities and the committees of the Verkhovna Rada and the MPs and experts. So we'll need to work in a very detailed manner on, let's say there is different thoughts, different approaches to the formula on distributing the subvention. We have different territorial communities by their size, by the structure of the community, whether it's one settlement or that's 90 settlements with large infrastructure. And so there has to be different approaches to that subvention. And this is something we're going to work. Then I'd like to focus on one more thing. It's important for local authorities to have received these authorities. I mean, they have to help, they have to control, they have to monitor. And different stakeholders have different roles, but local authority have to do a lot of job. And they need to receive proper training. And that's our common goal. And then through the system of education, through a system of different meetings, we'll try to implement that. And in conclusion, I'd like to respond to the statement of our moderator, since local communities have more officials, public officials nowadays. Look, we have 11.5 southern territorial communities and village councils and village council heads. There were 11.5 southern secretaries, accountants, and so on and so forth. So now we have 1,469 plus the city of Kyiv territorial communities. And of course, the workload has increased, and some of the authorities were delegated from the oblast authorities to local authorities. Part of the public officials were transferred to local self-governments and self-authorities. So we were working on how to help those public officials who couldn't find their job after the optimization process. So I wouldn't call it a challenge that I would try to ask. I would like to ask you not to create those myths that there is an increase in the number of officials, but look, the number of those public officials has been reduced. As I've said, you can take a look at the number of the heads of village councils. There were 11,500 of them, and now close to 1,400. So let's take an opportunity, since we have a specialized portal and a question from a representative of that portal. I have a question to Valentina. When are you planning to have the next research, and what would be the topic for that research? Well, this is the first stage of the research, and we've already outlined the major directions to proceeding further. This is the main areas for the reform, sectoral reform in the education. So the next step will be dedicated to that. Speaking on the timeframes for the monitoring, will start in 2022, and the results will be demonstrated in 2023. So thank you for the attention. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to express words of gratitude for this discussion and for having representatives of different authorities. Once again, that was the presentation on decentralization of the management of education in territorial communities. This is the result of a joint work of experts from DOCIDE project, the Kyiv Institute of Sociology, the Embassy of Switzerland, and we can see a lot of logos. And we are grateful to the Ministry for the Development of Territorial Communities and Ministry of Education and the Agency of Public Officials and Territorial Communities, to all those MPs who joined us and who expressed an interest, even because of this significant amount of information. You haven't come up with any questions. Now at least you know who's responsible for what. Now at least we can see the coordination and not the redundancy. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to UCMC for this opportunity to work.